There's an exciting movement in the field of psychotherapy training to incorporate more purposeful, clear, skill-based training, something called deliberate practice, into our growth as therapists. And already the research is showing the results. Deliberate practice is the most powerful and well-researched avenue for gaining expertise. So the term deliberate practice was originally coined by Anders Ericsson, who's sort of an expert on the field of expertise. Deliberate practice is a phenomenon he discovered as he was researching what it takes to improve in any field. Now, the concept was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers with the 10,000-hour rule. But today I want to talk to you about deliberate practice in psychotherapy. While most any other field has found ways to incorporate deliberate practice into skills training, whether they call it that or not, the field of psychotherapy is only just beginning to do so. But right off the bat, I want to say, even though the idea of deliberate practice in psychotherapy is new, there's already a lot of research to support it as being superior to our normal training methods. My friend Alexander Avash, who's really spearheading a lot of the research, was showing me a globe where you could see all the places where deliberate practice is happening, and it's really happening all over the world. And the results so far are really promising. And in fact, what they're finding is when a training incorporates deliberate practice, compared to just our usual way of training therapists, which is largely lectures, that those trainings actually lead to better outcomes for clients. So that's a really important thing to measure and for us to care about in our training of therapists. So I first heard about deliberate practice about 5 years ago. I had sent something out to a listserv, and in response, as like a return offering, Tony Romanier sent me a manuscript. And it was a book that was about to get published. I believe it was the first one focusing on how to incorporate deliberate practice into psychotherapy training. And I remember getting it one Sunday morning and my husband taking the kids and just sort of poring over his manuscript because I found it so compelling. And here's his basic argument. While in grad school, the training we receive is very didactic, very intellectual, kind of left brain, highly conceptual. We learn through lectures, through reading books. Whereas being a therapist requires doing. It takes active engagement in a process. So in the room, we need more than concepts, we need skills. So the bottom line of the whole deliberate practice, or DP, movement is an effort to make training more experiential, more hands-on, more focused on very small, clear learning objectives, right? Very clear skills, where there's time and space to slow down and try those skills with repetition. So this is moving beyond simply learning theory. And I'm actually a big believer in theory. I think it's important to understand attachment theory or how racial trauma impacts the nervous system, I think when we understand how the human mind works, it makes us more flexible therapists and adds depth and substance to our work. But it isn't enough. So before we go on, I just want to suggest perhaps why this question around training is really important. Why? Because in the last 50 years, our outcomes haven't improved as a field. That's actually astonishing. Can you imagine if the field of medicine hadn't improved in the results it gets in the last 50 years? It would be really tragic. And I actually think it is tragic that we haven't found better and better ways to help people. So if you might think, if we're needing to improve, well, we should improve our theories. That would kind of fit if you follow like the medical model, improving, a technique or a medicine, the active ingredients in a medicine. And I think that's what we've been kind of doing or assuming. In our field, we focus a lot on outcome research, figuring out, what to do, even cleaning up our act through manualizing treatment. But what we found is something called the dodo bird effect, which means that as many new therapies as we try and invent, we tend to get the same ultimate outcome with clients. That's why many people are calling for the end of randomized control trials, because we haven't really found like the magic bullet from them. And also, when we're doing that type of research, we're not learning much about what is healing in the process. I will say we do learn more from what's called process research, or from like the approaches that these wonderful minds like Diana Fosha or Bruce Ecker, Habib Davanloo have taken. What they've done is recorded their sessions, waited for really like transformational moments to occur where really change happens, and then they'll go back to the session before that and see like, well, what happened that helped that change occur? I kind of think of it as like reverse engineering. And because of that, we actually do have some really wonderful theories and some wonderful clinicians. Like, when you watch people like Dick Schwartz or Stan Tatkin or Peter Levine, you really know that there's a very high ceiling for what is possible. So in that sense, I think we really have learned over the last 50 years, like what's possible has improved. However, that learning hasn't translated into better outcomes for the average therapist. And that's why, in my mind, we might want to think about shifting from trying to improve our therapies toward trying to improve our therapists. And to do that, we have to improve our methods of training. So let me give evidence for the fact that our training right now isn't hitting the mark. And that is the fact that most therapists don't improve over the whole course of their career. Now that's the average therapists. Many people are getting great results and they're improving their results over time. But many therapists are not. Instead of slowing down, really honing in on our weaker skills and practicing them, I think we simply get more and more ingrained in our bad habits. Now, I feel very passionate about this because I believe therapists are really trying. We want desperately to help. And often we're sacrificing a lot to be in this profession. Bonnie Badenoch says, when you're a therapist, you're signing up to co-suffer with your clients. I've just never met a therapist who doesn't really want to help. We do this as a calling. So if the average therapist isn't improving, there's something that needs to change in the quality of mentorship or support or the culture or norms, right? And the approach to learning, just in terms of how we focus our efforts towards growth. So how do we support our therapists in their growth? For me, there's really two domains. One is more really the topic of this video, which is like teaching therapists certain skills and helping them practice them. But the other one I do want to mention, which I think is creating more safety. I just want to touch on this too, because I don't think we do enough to create safety in the learning process for our therapists. And when any of our minds are stressed or under threat, it's like our learning switch goes off in our brain. I'm drawing from polyvagal theory and interpersonal neurobiology. The science is so clear that safety is key to learning. That's actually why we study so much how to create safety in the therapy process. But we don't apply that for some reason in our training of therapists. Our whole field studies human development and growth. So the fact that we haven't been more curious and put more research into what does the therapist's mind, as a human, need in order to develop and grow and step into being a therapist, I think that's mind-boggling. We would never do in therapy what we do in supervision. Imagine if therapy looked like supervision. Your client would come in, you'd ask some shaming questions, and then give advice. Like, well, have you tried standing up to your husband yet? Oh, you haven't? Well, I'm giving you the homework to do that before we meet next week. That's not a process. That's not growth. We know how growth works, how it has to be experiential, and how that we need the safety to explore and play and slow down to be curious. In my mind, our failure in this area is why 35% of supervision is actually harmful. On the other hand, 95% is inadequate, and that goes to this next piece around learning to train therapists to do actual skills. So let's go ahead and turn our focus to that, and that's where deliberate practice comes in. So how did deliberate practice in psychotherapy first come onto the scene? Well, largely through the study of what are called super shrinks. So while the average therapist doesn't really improve over time, the top 25% of therapists actually get really great results, 10 times the outcomes. In the literature, they call these the super shrinks. So we know it's possible to learn and grow and to get fairly consistent positive results. So Scott Miller is the person who's done the most research on super shrinks. And as he was trying to figure out, what are these amazing therapists doing that's different, or what about them is different, he tested things like degrees earned, certification, years of experience, gender, theoretical orientation, ways the therapists describe themselves, and again, nothing seemed to correlate. He eventually got frustrated and almost gave up. That's when he came upon the work of Anders Ericsson, and he learned that level of performance in other fields directly correlates to time spent in deliberate practice. So he was the first person to think, hey, let's go back to that research and see if perhaps these special therapists are getting better results because they're simply working harder to learn and grow. And sure enough, that's what he found. He found that in session, super shrinks really track client engagement. They invite client engagement, and when it's missing, they see what they can do to bring the clients back into the process. They very actively get feedback and really encourage the client to give honest feedback because they really want to know how to change or adjust the approach to fit the client's needs. So there's a way that super shrinks are wonderful at creating collaboration and engagement. Then they take the feedback and work to improve between sessions. In fact, the way I've heard it described is perhaps instead of just focusing on what to do in session, we need to focus more on what to do between sessions. Because it turns out that super shrinks spend 14 times more time between sessions, 1 hour on average a day, versus the bottom 25% of therapists who only spend half an hour a week. And how do they use this time? Kind of in two main ways. They focus on the basics, and they also identify their own personal growth edge and systematically work to improve on it. Why do they feel motivated to improve? Well, because super shrinks have been shown to be incredibly humble. There's actually a lot of great research linking humility to better client outcomes. Which means, by the way, if earlier, when you heard me say the average therapist doesn't improve, if you were worried that that was you, that actually could be a good sign. It's actually a wonderful article called "Therapists, Love Yourself as a Person, Doubt Yourself as a Therapist." In any case, this insight, where Miller really used Erikson's ideas to understand what they were finding in the research, is really what brought DP into focus for our field. And once we sort of realized, hey, the general research on expertise shows that deliberate practice, DP, is the key, more than intelligence or innate ability, and it is not something we're doing at all in our field. It just seems so obvious that this was an important new frontier to explore. So the idea of deliberate practice is really quite simple. When a person, usually in solitude, engages in an activity, typically designed by a teacher, with a primary goal of improving some aspect of performance, we call that activity deliberate practice. At least that's how Anders Ericsson talks about it. But it isn't just practicing by rote, it's active, purposeful, systematic, with a lot of focus, and also typically a narrow focus just on one skill at a time. In other words, it's deliberate. The easiest way to visualize this is to think about other fields. Picture a basketball player, dribbling the ball or throwing hoops again and again, or a pianist doing scales or chords. Typically, they're focusing on one skill at a time because the brain can't learn many things at once. When we slow down in that way and do something with repetition and focus, it gives the brain a chance to adjust and learn, right? The way we think about with procedural memory or muscle memory. Imagine if a piano teacher taught their student in the way we teach therapists. That would look like the student going out in front of an audience and performing a piece, then coming to the teacher and reporting on how they did. Then the teacher may be giving some feedback or teaching a bit, and then sending them back to perform again, making all the changes simultaneously without having a chance to practice them first, just moving right back into performance. Now, I use the word performance here purposefully, because while we call the work we do our practice, it's really actually performance, because we're doing the full thing, with the client there, with everything happening. It's not practice. And the truth is, we don't improve by performing a thing. The research shows that how many times a surgeon performs a surgery is not predictive of outcomes. What is time spent practicing the skills they need to do that surgery. So this really begins to shed light on why therapists might not be getting better results over time. And in fact, maybe even ingraining bad habits. Because as a field, we over-rely on performance, kind of expecting that clinical experience or more hours will just lead to growth. And we haven't found ways to incorporate practice into our culture. So why haven't we done this yet? Well, it's kind of understandable. A basketball player can spend time alone with their basketball, or a piano player alone with their piano. But we can't ask our clients to come home with us, like sit them on the couch and say, I'm going to try this technique again and again, or have a session and say, pause right there, because that went really well, so I want to just repeat it 20 times, So it is more difficult for us. But that's where simulation-based learning comes in, which is actually not a new idea. It's like pilots that practice simulated flights before getting into an actual plane. It's not the easiest thing to simulate therapy, but it can work reasonably well. The most obvious example would be using videos, maybe watching an actor play out a certain type of scenario and practicing certain skills. We can use role play, we can use imagery. But what are the advantages of simulation-based learning? Well, we can stop, repeat, focus on one thing at a time. We can record ourselves or be interrupted for feedback. Students can go at their own pace. That's sort of the level that's appropriate for us. And by the way, that's a big deal in deliberate practice world, finding the right difficulty level. Not too easy, not too hard, right? Too easy, maybe you're not learning as much, but too difficult, you're going to be overwhelmed and not be able to stay present. So in simulation-based learning, you can get the difficulty level just right. And in the process, no one gets hurt. So when doing deliberate practice, there are two main areas where therapists can focus. One, interpersonal skills. It could be like our typical therapy skills, common factors, although we also can have theory-specific deliberate practice. And second, intrapersonal skills. That's our internal emotional awareness and capacity. So what would be an example of interpersonal skills? I was recently watching a video by Daryl Chow, who's also one of the main researchers in deliberate practice, and he was giving an example of teaching therapists to deal with anger. So what they noticed, I believe it was him and Miller, but that the students were going so quickly for the vulnerable feelings underneath the client's anger at the therapist, saying, oh gosh, were you feeling hurt, or how did I hurt you? Rather than really just making some space for the client to be angry. So as they noticed this as a skill that needed to be developed, they could do some repetition with the scenario of, the client being angry at the therapist and the therapist practicing saying certain things out loud in response. And think about the difference between that and maybe hearing a lecture where the presenter happens to mention to make space for anger. I mean, even just think about it in terms of state-dependent learning. In a conference, you're sitting back in your comfy chair, you've got your coffee, you're not in the heat of a therapy session, right? So, but if you've practiced it a little bit more in vivo like that, then when it actually comes up clinically, in that moment, your brain will say, hey, I already did this 20 times. Last year, my sister and I made a course through Academy of Therapy Wisdom, where we really tried to delineate some core basic skills we think therapists need to learn, and we tried to incorporate some experiential learning, almost like deliberate practice aspect into the training. So for instance, we have a whole list of different types of experiential questions you might ask to help the client focus inward. And we just had our students really practice saying those questions out loud, just to develop the vocabulary and language. Then we watch a demo where I would first kind of model using those types of questions. And then we'd have them watch it again, where it would pause, when it was time for the therapist to speak. So the students could just practice coming up with the types of questions that could create an inner focus. We also had some videos where the client is in resistance and kind of frustrated with therapy. And then we just practice little principles. Daryl Chow says principles over protocol. What is the principle? Noticing disengagement, asking for feedback, being non-defensive, expressing curiosity, even expressing two different types of empathy. So those are all examples of interpersonal practice. Now let's give some examples of intrapersonal. So intrapersonal means managing our own emotional responses and developing our capacity to focus, be present, be self-aware. So this is the personal growth aspect, right? Certainly we can engage that through engaging in therapy or a mindfulness practice, but also it can be approached with deliberate practice as a series of skills. So an obvious example of this that I've seen others do and we did in our course as well is have the student clinicians watch some videotape of session while at the same time doing mindfulness. I think this is important because a lot of the time when we do mindfulness, we set up everything to make it as easy as possible to focus. We make it quiet, maybe we gaze at a flickering flame, But in therapy, it's not all designed to make us perfectly comfortable and quiet and inward focused. It's very distracting. We're having to listen to someone, to cognitively follow them, or maybe having to listen to content that is very emotionally stimulating. Yes, it's important that we therapists practice just mindfulness in general, but we also need to take it a step further and have some context where we can practice mindful inner awareness while watching something that simulates therapy, whether it's a video of a client that we have, or an actor, or some kind of role play. If this all sounds too basic, I'd like to challenge that, because everything builds on the basics. Think of the piano player who practices scales every day. So I do want to say, while I've been excited about finding ways to incorporate a more deliberate practice mentality into some of the online courses I make, really for it to be considered deliberate practice, certain things are required. For sort of full-on gold standard deliberate practice, you would typically need a coach, someone to watch your work, and to craft exercises just for you, right? And then once you've done those exercises or done the practice, you can bring it back to them and see if there's improvement. So here are the kind of 5 sort of elements of deliberate practice. First, observe your work. 2, get expert feedback. 3, have small learning goals. 4, do behavioral rehearsal. And 5, assess performance. They actually draw it as a circle because then you assess performance and then it's like, okay, now we can tweak and go back into practice. But if you're not quite ready to jump into hiring a deliberate practice coach or doing all of the aspects of that, what are some easy ways you can incorporate something a bit like deliberate practice into your daily life? One is by starting videotaping your sessions. There's so many ways to use videotapes, and I have to say that while we fear our clients are going to be uncomfortable being videotaped, the research shows that clients tend to be pretty comfortable with it. It's actually the therapists that find it uncomfortable. Once you have videotape, you can go back to see what didn't work, or even more importantly, perhaps what did work. You can pause, think of what you wish you had said and, repeat it and try practicing saying that thing again and again. You could do the mindfulness practice we talked about. There's so many ways to use videotape, including, asking someone for feedback around it. So by the way, none of this is easy or immediately rewarding. As the deliberate practice folks talk about, it doesn't pay. No one is paying us to do this, and it's not play, which is innately rewarding, right? But the reward does come. When I was growing up, I trained in classical piano, and I remember just wanting to sit down and play the whole piece, especially Chopin. I love Chopin. It would be so much more enjoyable and beautiful just to play the song. But I knew every time I let myself do that, I would get slightly worse. So instead, what I had to pull myself back and choose to do instead was take some element, one hand or the other, just practicing being even. Sometimes I would even practice just one finger at a time and seeing how fast that finger could, push the key. And that was not rewarding and not fun. That being said, whenever I had some time of practicing like that, then the reward was I could sit back and just let myself play the piece, and it would come out naturally, so much more beautifully than if I hadn't done the work. So for us as therapists, the reward comes when our sessions flow, when the work is deeper and more meaningful, and ultimately when our clients' lives improve. So I encourage you to be part of this exciting exploration and conversation around how to incorporate deliberate practice in training as a psychotherapist. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you did, you can help me out by liking and subscribing. Or if you're a therapist who would like to train with me while earning CEUs, you can visit my website at toriolds.com.